You're watching Understanding Inequality in a Globalizing World, Lessons for the 21st Century, featuring Nobel Prize-winning economist Professor Sir Angus Deaton and Professor Anne Case from Princeton University. This program is part of China and World Dialogue Series, presented by the Center for China and Globalization. This session is moderated by CCG President Dr. Wang Huiyao and joined by CCG Vice President and Senior Economist Dr. David Blair. Thank you for tuning in. Dr. Wang, over to you.
Thank you, Anne, and good evening and good morning. Welcome to CCG China and World Dialogue Series, Understanding Inequality in a Globalized World, Lessons for the 21st Century. CGT dialogue, serious dialogue we have conducted for the last 2 months. We have already had a series of meaningful and stimulating discussions with global opinion leaders and well-known scholars and also former politicians as well. So we already had quite a number of them. We just had the one with Martin Wolf, the FT chief commentator yesterday. And today we are very privileged to have both well-known, two world-renowned economists from Princeton University, also a famous husband-wife team. Congratulations. So Angus Deaton, who is the Nobel economic laureate, and also Professor Anne Case, a prominent economist on her own right and co-author of The Death of Despair. So good morning, Deaton and Professor Deaton, and also good morning, Professor Case. Thank you for joining us this early hour in Princeton. I'd like to introduce first Professor Sir Angus Deaton. He's a senior scholar and a Durite Eisenhower Professor at Economics and International Affairs, Emeritus at Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs of Economics Department at Princeton University. His main current research areas are in poverty, inequality, health, well-being, economic development, and randomized controlled trials. So we're very knowledgeable and very well-known economist. He holds both American and British citizenship, a global citizen, and also he has taught both at US, UK, and many other universities. He was the president of American Economic Association in 2009, and also he's a member and was a member of many well-known academic associations. So we're very pleased to have Sir Angus Deaton join us today. Also, we're very happy to have Professor Anne Case, is the excellent 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs, Emeritus at Princeton University, where she continues to teach in the School of Public and International Affairs, a very well-known school. Dr. Case has written extensively on health over life course. She has been awarded the Kenneth Arrow Prize in Health Economics from International Health Economic Association for her work on the links between economic status and health status in childhood, and also got the Cozzarelli Prize from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science for her research on midlife mobility and also mortality. Dr. Case currently serves on the Committee of National Statistics, also very well-known organization. Also, the discussion today, we are very fortunate to have both of you, and we hope that we have a lot of interesting discussion. We are actually carry this live, and we have many audience watching us online in China and other parts of the world. So today's discussion is also joined by my colleague, Dr. David Blair, Vice President and Senior Economist at CCG. Dr. Blair specializes in the banking and finance, macroeconomics, entrepreneurship, and healthcare. He has a PhD in economics from UCLA and was a McCarthy postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University Center for Science and International Affairs. So for the 17 years, he was the professor and also the economics chair of the economic department at Eisenhower School of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. So David has actually already been a visiting scholar at CITIC Securities and also senior columns for China Daily before he joined CCG last year. So we're very pleased to have all of you. So today we are actually, what I hold in my hand is actually the new book, Death of Despair, basically a book that, and also the future of capitalism, a book co-authored by Professor Angus and Professor Angus Deaton, published last year. So this is really a very interesting book. I was really struck by the book that you mentioned in the book. Life expectancy has across the world has been constantly rising for almost a century, but actually is become a hallmark actually for the highly developed nations. But the income, here comes the strange trend that it's also coming down. So, but before we get into that, also I want to have Professor Deaton and also Professor Case to say a few words at the beginning, to maybe introduce the book you just published last year to our Chinese audience. So Professor Deaton maybe, or Professor Case, for both of you, yes.
Yeah, when we first started this work, which was what, in the summer of 2014, so 7 years ago now, we noticed this reversal where mortality in midlife, people in their 40s and 50s, which had been declining for more than a century, a bit rocky sometimes, but a pretty steady decline, had started turning around. So, and instead of continuing to go down from the mid-90s until when we were writing, it had started to rise. And so this is something you really don't expect to see at all. We didn't know at the time that overall life expectancy was falling.
But what was happening was only happening in the US. So when we compared what was happening in the US to other wealthy countries, other English-speaking countries, their mortality rates continued to fall. So progress was continuing elsewhere, but in the US, in one particular group among whites, which are the most privileged group in the US, mortality rates had started to rise. And this came as a surprise to us. And it came as a surprise to all of the other people that we showed this to. We thought everyone must know this who works in this area, but it was a shock. So that was the beginning. And we started to dig to try to find out what is going on here. Why did progress stop? Not just for a year, but over 2 decades.
Right. It was such a shock at the time, we had a lot of trouble getting the paper published.
Yeah.
And of course, when eventually we did get it published, there was just a tsunami of interest in it. I like to tell the story that I got the Nobel Prize in October of 2015, and there's a huge amount of publicity that comes with that, as I'm sure you know. But this paper then came out 2 weeks later, and the publicity around this paper was just huge compared even with what had happened with the Nobel Prize. So we knew we really put our finger on a nerve, and that people were very excited about this.
Yeah, no, this is a fascinating book, actually. When we read it, I think that you have done a very substantial analysis and with all the data and discovery, actually. I mean, you were basically, it's the life expectancy in the wealthiest countries in the world is fell for the first time in decade. And life expectancy in the US fell again in 2016 and for the third time in a row in 2017. So maybe, I mean, now we're also hit by this pandemic going on around the world. So So I think U.S. of course is one of the wealthiest countries, achieved a high life expectancy, but lessons for other countries to learn, for China and for the world. So what we can learn from that, because China is actually getting a bit high life expectancy now, and we just as a population census report released about 2 days ago, and so China is having a improved life expectancy, but we should be careful to learn the lessons from other countries as well. Maybe you could share some light on that as well.
Well, I think this is not a very helpful thing, but one of the things to say is to make sure that some of the things that happened in the United States do not happen elsewhere. So that's one of the lessons. It doesn't tell you in detail. I mean, I've talked about this in China before, but we draw an analogy in the book with what happened in China in the 19th century, when opium dealers from Britain sort of forced their way into selling opium to the Chinese people, very much against local wishes. And to some extent, there's a parallel with what happened in the United States, that very powerful pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceutical distributors distributed enormous amounts of opioids, essentially legalized heroin, which caused terrific trouble in the United States with many people dying.
So the three causes of death that were rising that caused mortality to turn the wrong way in the US were suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholic liver disease. So we, as a shorthand, started to call those deaths of despair. And that was really just a shorthand for those three causes of death. But in those three causes of death, what we saw was a great deal of despair, that people don't kill themselves with drugs or alcohol or a gun unless something is going very badly wrong in their lives. So we in the book, what we did was first document that this was indeed happening throughout the US, but only for people who were not well educated, only for people who did not have a 4-year college degree. And so from there, we turned to economics to ask the question, what is it that's happened in the US that has happened only to people without a 4-year college degree that might be a powerful enough force that people would start killing themselves in very large numbers?
And a very important part of that story throughout was that it wasn't happening in other rich countries around the world. Or if it was happening, and it is happening a little in Britain, Canada, and Ireland, it's not happening to anything like the same scale as is happening in the United States, which means that stories about globalization or technical change, which many people tend to blame, you can't really tell that story without saying, why is globalization and technical change having such different effects in Germany and Britain than it's having in the United States?
Could I ask you to delve a little bit deeper into the sort of the deep causes? I was very struck by your statement a minute ago that you want other countries to be able to draw on the lessons of what the U.S. suffered and not repeat the same mistakes. I never thought I'd be looking back on the 1970s as possibly a kind of a golden age. But at that time, median real wages were going up, which they haven't been since 1979. Do you think? Can you discuss a bit more what you think either policy changes or environmental changes or social changes that you were driving it? Was it a change in society? Was it failure to enforce anti-monopoly laws, changes in the financial system? There are all sorts of hypotheses, and I'd just like you to elaborate on what you think the major causes were.
Well, we can push these back and forward between us, but almost all of the above. A lot of bad things are happening. The question really is to establish, the right, what caused what through this sort of chain. So there's been a lot of social disintegration, which Bob Putnam famously wrote about it in terms of bowling alone, and how. He wrote to us and said he thought the title of our book was the best title he'd seen in many, many years. And he said, you're talking to the guy who wrote Bowling Alone, right? But our book is very sympathetic is very parallel to what Bob was writing. But we really think of Anne should talk about some of the other things that are happening, the morbidity, the pain, all these other things, the lack of marriage, church going, and so on. Yeah. But we tend to push it back to the labor market.
So the high water mark for blue collar wages in the US was 1972. And since then, wages for people without a college degree have been falling. For men first, for women with a lag, but they've been falling now for a couple of decades as well.
They rise in booms. And, so it's not like it's been continuous fall. It's just that you get this ratchet effect that they rise a bit in the boom and then they fall and they never get back to where they were before. So, in the Trump boom, which many people pushed as being, the best labor market there'd been in a century, real wages for people without a 4-year college degree were lower than at any date in the 1980s, for example.
So part of that is certainly that there was globalization, there was automation, those things were happening and certainly would have made blue collar workers more vulnerable. So part of it is a policy decision about whether or not the workers who were affected were going to be retrained, whether or not the pie getting bigger through globalization was going to be distributed to everyone or was going to be just distributed among the people at the top. So part of that is policy in terms of what was going on. But the other part that's different about the US is the way that we finance our healthcare system. And that plays an important role in the story in a way that's kind of happening behind the curtain. Because we tie health insurance to employers in the US, which is highly unusual. If you combine that with the fact that the healthcare industry got larger and larger and more expensive, what that meant was that employers had to pay a larger and larger premium to hire any worker, including those blue collar workers. So that came out of blue collar wages. So as healthcare went from being what it was, which was not much of GDP back in, let's say, 1960, to being $1.05 by the time we get to 2020, what that meant was that blue collar wages fell as more money was spent on their healthcare.
And also the jobs went with it. So, if you're an employer and you have to pay $20,000 a year to hire, a janitor or a cleaner, it's meant that very, very few large firms in America have any cleaning staff. The mailroom is gone, the security staff, the food services workers, the drivers, they're all not all, but nearly all are contracted out. And this is not contracted out to China or India. I mean, we're talking about contracting out to local firms that supply labor.
Mm-hmm. I was struck by a number that the share of GDP going to capital and labor. Back when I was in graduate school 30 or 40 years ago, that was considered fixed. You can just take it as fixed and run with it. But it's been declining. I mean, the labor share has been declining, 7 or 8% over the last 30, 40 years in the US, which is a big change. Can you talk about what's going on there?
Well, this is a very hot area in labor economics and in those study firms. And there's no agreement as to exactly what those forces are. So this is a ferment in economic analysis right now. And it's not clear that the same thing is happening elsewhere. I mean, I'm working with a group in London, and we've spent a lot of time looking at the British labor share, and some people think it's fallen in the same way. Other people think it has not fallen as much.
No.
But one of the themes in this work, and I don't really want to tell you the answer because I don't think we know, is that power plays a much bigger role than economists used to think it did. Market power plays a lot more. So there's a lot of wondering about whether there's a lot more monopsony, with firms having power over the workers, more monopoly, firms having power over their product prices, and the decline in unions. And, the decline in unions has happened pretty much everywhere, but it's happened very fast in the United States. So there's almost no private sector unions left. And
I'm struck by how much more competitive many market sectors are in China than in the United States. I just bought a car, and it's a extremely highly competitive market for cars here. And the price is maybe 2/3 of the price of an equivalent car in the US.
So car dealers are very well protected in the US, right? So there are regulations that help protect those sellers, which is, it's not just cars. There are so many areas where corporations and heads of groups have gone to Washington and gotten protection. So if you're working, within a protected sector, you do very well. But that means that the people who aren't protected are paying the price for that.
And we think that, not us, but many other scholars too, have begun to think of the bachelor's degree as the ticket into sort of a protected sector. And you don't face competition. But just to elaborate on something you just said, which is very important, our friend Thomas Philippon has written a book about price trends in Britain compared with price trends even in the EU. And, he was someone who came from France to the US as a graduate student. And he was struck with cell phones, exactly what you just said about cars. They were much better quality than they were in France, and they were much cheaper. And now, in 2020, they're not as good as in France, and they're much more expensive. And that's true for a whole range of goods. And again, this is tending to feed this idea that American markets are just not as competitive as they are in Europe, let alone in China.
So the lesson for Chinese regulators is market regulation.
Yeah, I'd like to I think we have started a very good topic on these issues. I think what is going on at in lessons learned from US, but we had a very good open discussion now. I mean, you talk about all those factors, education, healthcare, and robotics, globalization. So we are actually now having this pandemic, and we're probably going to see the situation deteriorate further as time goes on, with all the factors multiply. And so the question I want to raise is that now we're now in this globalized world, and deaths of despair, and also the future of capitalism, which is the book that you had many interesting things. Education. People who had a 4-year education have a better income level, and also the countries spending on the healthcare, how they run the healthcare system, and also the globalization, how the jobs, technology go in play, all those factors. It's really fascinating. I mean, I think that is really also stimulating China as well. I think that is exactly China probably is doing as well. The latest population census give the data that China now has 280 million among its population, 280 million people among its population have a college degree or currently in a college. So which means this is going to really help the future of them. So that's probably one of the lessons we learned from your book as well. Second, the health. The health is really striking that U.S. has actually spent, according to the number you have, is almost 20% GDP on the health system, whereas China is about 5 or 6%. But China's already almost have 1.3 billion people and some kind of medical coverage, and also that life expectancy. China is probably only 2 or 3 years shortage of U.S. now, and is quickly catching up. And also China was this year, they announced that China has lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. And also the Chinese family values, and there's a companion at the family encouragement, whereas they can avoid those kind of a suicide or maybe depressed or whatever. So what do you think about what China has done, and then what can be prevented in the future that not going to repeat some of the lessons maybe we're having, or maybe has some how we can really improve that? Probably you are the authorities on that, and I'd like to hear also.
So there are several things to pick up on here. I mean, it's a really fascinating set of issues. Just to start with education, other countries don't seem to have this strict divide between you have a college degree or you don't. And if you have a college degree, you're protected and your life is going well. Whereas if you don't have a college degree, it's very hard to get married. It's very hard to have a community life that's meaningful. In other countries, that's not happening. So it seems like that is something that's in some way special to the US. And it may be that in other countries, there's not stigma attached to having jobs that are meaningful jobs that you need skills for, but you don't need a college degree for. So that's one thing. I don't know if you want to.
Well, this education thing is very hard, and there's a lot of controversy about it too. But what you were saying about the progress that China has made in educating people, that's got to be good. We believe in education. We're college professors. How could we not believe in education? Both of us grew up in pretty humble backgrounds, and for us, the educational system was our escape. It was what allowed us to move into success and the things we've done in our lives. So we're not going to say anything bad about education. Education gives people skills or allows latent skills to be expressed. And that's good for them, and it's good for the country, and it's good for everybody. So that's a terrific thing. But there's another role of education, which seems to be as a marker of social status. Mm. And having a BA in America seems to increasingly have become what the philosopher Michael Sandel has called a key to respect, a key to social esteem, the key to a good job. And that has a big downside as well as upside. So, we're not going to badmouth education, but it's more the role that this BA degree has come to play in the United States. So that, I think, has been problematic.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, no, please.
I was going to say also to pick up on something else that you mentioned, which was on values or family values. In America, among conservatives, they like to point to the erosion of family values, that people are no longer industrious and that people are no longer sort of like have a moral compass that says we live in a family and we take care of our family. Instead, what we have are people cohabiting, they break up, they may have had a child in their first cohabitation, but then they have a new cohabitation, they have another child, and their home life is just very, very fragile. But we kind of argue in the book that it's much easier to be virtuous if you have a good job. If you have a job where you have prospects, where there's on-the-job training, where you feel like you have a future, it's much easier to kind of support a lifestyle that's stable if you feel that you have status, meaning in your work, and you know that that work is going to lead you to a good life.
There's a sort of old Marxist belief that social relations depend on the means of production. And that seems to be what's happening here. I mean, we see the disintegration of these, these towns where people used to have good working class, blue-collar jobs for working class people as being behind this social disintegration.
How would you
Yes. I'd like to raise another question before I get back to David, is that one of the things you mentioned in this book about inequality, and also is one of the things that we notice has been widely happening around the world. I mean, as globalization deepens, we see the inequality. For example, we notice that, for example, the 1% of the U.S. Most elite or people in the top bracket, that their wealth is almost equal to 45% of the mass population, and that actually in many developed countries have the same trend on that. And whereas also the company is going global, but then they are not probably benefiting exactly the home country or the host country of that, and that's where, for example, NAFTA was blamed for hovering out the Midwest and not benefiting U.S. on that. So and now China probably become another reason to bash for as well, because if the multinationals, the Fortune 500 is not really having put their wealth offshore somewhere, that is the politics going on. I was talking to Martin Wolf. He was saying capitalism is global, but democracy is local. So if the population locally is not happy, then politician needs to find a scapegoat for that, and China easily to become a scapegoat very often. So what do you think about this inequality issue, and where the gap is getting wider and wider in the last several decades, and also even during the pandemic? I mean, we see the 1% is getting even wealthier. Stock market is all-time high now. So how we explain that, and what are the true challenges for our contemporary world?
Yeah, so I think you have to be careful here to separate different kinds of inequality, right? So there's inequality in income, which is what perhaps we first think about. And the top 1% is mostly about inequality in income. And then what you were talking about at the end there, which I think is becoming increasingly important, and some politicians in the United States, like Elizabeth Warren, for instance, be focusing much more on wealth inequality than an income inequality. And as you say, there's been this enormous explosion of wealth inequality during the pandemic, much more so in the United States than in Europe, for example, because the US stock market has gone up so much. And largely because the big tech companies are here in the US, and it's their enormous success during the pandemic, which has driven up those stock market values. But there's also the inequality we write about in our book, which is the inequality of respect, and of which in the US seems to come with education. And to us, that's the deepest problem, because the people, these people without a BA, have been sort of left behind. They're not politically represented. And what you say is exactly right. Our colleague Bob Kahane used to say that the major force today in international relations is what is happening within countries. That's exactly like what Martin Wolf said about democracy is local and globalization is global. Well, the threats to globalization today are coming from within countries, not from between countries. And we think it's this, if you like, disrespect of the separation or leaving these people behind who favor populist solutions that are the real threat to globalization. I mean, if you get another decade of Mr. Trump, then it's not clear how much will be left of globalization at the end of that.
mean, just to go back to what you said about NAFTA, speaking to some of the economists who were in the Clinton administration when NAFTA was passed, they knew that jobs would be lost in the US. But what they thought was that, well, this is a good time for the US to upskill. And so that those jobs would be lost, but those workers would be better skilled, they would retrain them, and then that would lift everyone. But what happened was NAFTA passed, the jobs were lost, but the upskilling never took place. So those people were sort of thrown out into the wilderness to fend for themselves. And that's going to foment a lot of anger over a period of time when people feel like they're not participating. They're not, when the rest of what they see as being, a wealth increasing among some groups, and they're not getting any part of that increase in the size of the pie. So, and that's a failure also of democracy in the US.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, Professor Deaton, that you mentioned about education, of course, one of the probably fundamental factors that dividing the social status as well. But also, we see the statistics as well at Princeton and Yale, for example, more students coming from family in the top 1% income than from the bottom 15%. 2/3 of the students in the Ivy League schools comes from family of top 20%. And also actually in the US, the chances of students from household with more than 200,000 in income scoring above 14,000 SAT college admission test is only 5, so so for those family that makes less than 200,000 is only 1 in 50. So 1 in 5 and 1 in 50, you see the income gap to make those difference. So even for the education, does that also related to the wealth that is not, inequality is not there, the gap is big, would that be a problem for US to continue, or the Western countries in general, probably?
Yeah, but Princeton and Yale are not the whole of the university sector apart from Yale. And it's not entirely clear that you get a huge advantage in going. I mean, I'm sure you get some, and parents think that it's certainly extremely competitive. And it's certainly true that, we know best at Princeton, but Princeton has made huge efforts to bring low income and minority kids to Princeton, and it very much changed the composition over the last 30 or 40 years. So I think we defend that record a little bit, but it's really hard. And for instance, I think they've probably been more successful at bringing minority students than they have of the children of working class whites, for example, that don't. But, there are many colleges, we spend our summers or a month in the summer in Montana, and, the state university at Bozeman, for instance, anyone who wants to walk in can get in. So you don't have to take exams and be let in. And, anyone can go and try. And of course, they have to pay fees, and that's a separate problem. So, that's built up some debt from that. But
I think the US is still. Yeah, I think US is still very strong in those, among the 100 top universities, US has half of that, and attract talents around the world, make a very innovative country. I think that probably is the core strength that US has. And I think China is also learning that. Of course, China has over 3,000 universities currently on campus, 35 million students on campus, total population 218 million college in campus, and also 0 to 9 grade, 98% of the student at the age of that is also enrolling as well. So I think that education probably is really, according to your study, is really one of the key factors that China is paying a lot of attention to that. Perhaps I would like to have David to comment on that as well. You've been living in China since 2016. I mean, and also you've been you study a lot of the wages development and all those labor economics and financing. And so maybe what's your take on that, on the compare with the country you come from, US, and also the country you already lived in for the last 6-7 years already? Yeah.
Well, I'll speculate about it for a minute. There's one term that I hear in Chinese that's a term that they use for taxi drivers or for anybody that operates equipment or any sort of skilled job, and it's Shifu. And it basically is the way people show respect to a manual worker. And a lot of these people are much poorer than typical people at equivalent jobs in the US. But I don't think they feel the pressure and the despair. Although, some of the delivery guys, they're usually young guys from the countryside, they work extremely hard, very long days, and they may be under a lot of pressure from their employers to do things rapidly. But even people working in the parks and stuff, I don't feel like they think they're looked down upon. Where I think American working class people now think they're just flat out looked down upon. And that, naturally that stokes anger and sort of a feeling of hopelessness. Do you think that's a right interpretation of what's going on?
Yes, absolutely. And that's also something that separates the US from, say, Europe, right? So if you go and travel in Europe, there's a lot of respect paid for people who do manual work that we don't see in the US.
But it's also true that some of it's common with Britain too. So one thing that many people have written about, and I think it's very important, is people who used to work for Bethlehem Steel in Baltimore, for instance, there's a new book called Fulfillment about Amazon, and are now working in Amazon warehouses. Where my grandfather died in a mining accident in Yorkshire, in the village where my father grew up, that mine is no longer there. The unions are no longer there. The solid, rock hard labor people who used to vote for the Labour Party are not there. They're voting conservative, and there's an Amazon warehouse on the site where the mine was. All right. Now, those jobs, many people have written how hard it is to work in an Amazon warehouse or so-called fulfillment center, but they're not dangerous like working in the mine, and they're not dangerous like working in the steelworker was, and they're relatively well paid. I mean, Amazon is paying something like $15 an hour in the US, but there is a sort of sense of despair that this is meaningless work that's working on a clock. And, these are more, what's the word? Anyway, they're more sociological accounts or individual accounts of people who've lived these lives and written about them. And there's a feeling that the meaning of life, is not what it was in those towns. And there's been a lot of loss of society. I mean, in these Yorkshire mining towns, there were these famous brass bands, and there were famous soccer clubs, and there was a social life built around those jobs, dangerous and dirty though they were. And there's no similar social life built around an Amazon warehouse. So I think that is happening pretty much, throughout Western Europe.
That's very much the story that Bob Putnam told for his hometown in yes. Ohio too. One thing that worries me is the next generation. Once one generation loses their job, then the children don't get well cared for often. They have psychological problems when they're young. So how do we solve this problem for the next generation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
That is a really good worry to have, because I think we are really worried about that as well. That if you've grown up and your mother is addicted to drugs, or your father committed suicide, or you're not in a stable home life. Also, the school that you attend isn't as good as the school would have been a generation ago, because the industry pulled out, the tax base imploded, and the school is not well funded, right? So the options for you for the future look pretty grim. So what do we do about this? Partly, I think and this is a heavy lift, but we need to think about changing the educational system, which right now in America is laser focused on the kids who are going to go to college. Mm. So if you're going to high school, but you're not college bound, you're sort of on your own. So we need to think about ways in which kids who are not going to go to university are going to get a skill set that's going to put them on a good career track where they could become skilled plumbers or electricians or all of the different computer needs that we will have. And we need to be thinking about how we make that happen. But that's going to be really difficult.
And there's actually a lot of interest in that on both the right and the left in the US on vocational education, of turning your system into something more like what you have in Germany, and so on. So, and also to come back to the drum we like to beat, you know, a lot of these local authorities are paying enormous sums of money for healthcare, and it's making it very hard for them to fund local schools, local education, local universities.
Just a point on China. There's a lot of interest around China into looking at the German apprenticeship system. But I still think there's too much attention on, especially among parents, and being sure their children aren't, you know, forcing them to go to school 15 hours a day. And that's a slight exaggeration. And getting on the sort of the Beida Tsinghua, Peking University Tsinghua track is very much, many parents are very much striving.
I found, you know, David, I found actually, as Professor Deaton and Professor Case just said, you know, the American have this phenomenon that people, you know, if there's high school, they're not pursuing university, and then maybe they don't have a very bright future. And same mentality actually is happening in China as well. And also people didn't even bother to go to the you know, vocational school or other specialized college because everybody wants to go to university. So that is not really a healthy thing. But on the other hand, Chinese people do work very hard. I mean, there's talk about 724 or 966, you know, 9 hours a day, 6 days a week or something. So what I think is that I also want to get our two distinguished scholars' advice is that you know, when this kind of a culture issue, how does that play in inequality or the country development or the prosperity? For example, I was invited to bid farewell for the former U.S. ambassador in China, and he said actually summarized what his impression on China. He said, okay, the Chinese people are working very hard, diligent people. They have attached great importance on education, and also they have a great, you know, stick to the family values as well. You know, there's a tremendous family value, and you know, attach great importance to the family. Basically, that's what he's saying. So even that, I mean, the family now, according to the population consensus, you know, 10 years ago there's about 4 persons in the family. Now it's about 3 something. So China is also changing on that as well. So what I'm asking is, would the culture, you know, China has a 5,000 years history. It was always, you know, trying to be neutral and inclusive, and would that play something in the country development as well, or inequality issue as well? China actually, there's a saying in China, you know, they don't mind that there's not enough, but they mind very much if not redistributed fairly. So we have this redistributing upward, in using your term, not downward, not trickling down, the wealth of a Western country, for example. So China is trying to avoid that. You know, for example, you know, having these massive, gigantic 4 decades of lifting 800 million people out of poverty. You know, 10 years ahead of SDG 2030 agenda of UN, #1 priority that cutting 70% of global poverty. Just by China alone. So what do you think about this culture and those historical factors and cultural factors?
Well, you may, I believe in these cultural factors. You know, I grew up in Scotland. In Scotland, you would hear many of the same things you just said about China. You know, we give enormous respect for education. Very, very strong family ties. Actually, yesterday or maybe the day before, I was talking to a group in the British Parliament, and one of the lords there, who was Scotsman, had said, you know, that what worried him most about Scotland today was these family values that were so strong in his day seem to be weakening there. But, you know, just come back to my half-joking comment about Marxism. You know, culture changes with the conditions of production. Mm-hmm. And, you know, those Scottish families were thriving within a system where there were jobs. And, you know, we have a friend, actually a brother-in-law, who said that when he decided to go to college in when the 70s? 1972. His friends in New York, a relatively poor area of New York, his parents were Italian immigrants, and said, why are you going to college? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. You know, you're going to use your diploma to pay the bills and so on. Now, in Scotland, that wasn't the case. People really wanted to go to college. So, but these things change. And in these times in America where there were good jobs, where there were factories and so on. So every country is facing this change. And, you know, the change is always going to be difficult to handle. And it seems to be particularly badly handled in the United States. I think China has done very well. I mean, you embraced a form of markets, a form of capitalism, which has generated enormous amount of wealth and relieved a lot of poverty. But there are really dangers there too, because capitalism can get out of hand. And David had said, you know, Chinese markets are very competitive. You got to keep them that way, because there are real dangers of people who get very rich undermining a competitive system. And a lot of that seems to happen in the US.
Could I follow up on a question that Henry asked a few minutes ago about the causes of this evolution? I mean, as I see it, there are three major ideas that are out there. One is that it's globalization. You know, let's blame Mexico, or then let's blame China. You know, it's competition in the labor market, and that's having a negative effect. Another idea is that it's domestic policy changes. And I noticed there's a quote in your book where it says, rent-seeking is a major cause of wage stagnation among working class Americans and has much to do with the deaths of despair. I'd like you to elaborate on that, and for our non-economists in the audience, explain what you mean by rent-seeking. And the third explanation is that it's just technological change and automation, and there's nothing we can do about it. So it could be a mix of those things, but I'd like to know what you think the majority of the cause is.
Well, I think that, you know, let's take globalization and technical change off the table, because they're there. They're very important. All countries are facing them on one side or the other, right? But you're not getting the deaths of despair in most of Europe that you get in the United States. So, and maybe if your audience, say a few words about rent-seeking. So, you know, rent-seeking is when a business, basically, what businesses should be doing is making stuff and selling stuff and getting rich from doing that and innovating and making us all better off. That's a wonderful thing. That's what capitalism is really good at, what markets are really good at. But, you know, there's another way that people can make money, which is they can go to the government and get some special rule or regulation passed, which makes them rich at the expense of everybody else. And that's rent-seeking, right? And that is unproductive. It's capitalism at its worst. And the real danger in the story we're telling is that in many industries, and healthcare among them, you know, they've been very good at getting special regulations passed which protect them from competitive markets so that they can get rich at the expense of everybody else. And the story we tell, which some people agree with and some people don't, is that in addition to the automation and globalization that's threatening the jobs of many working class people in America, we've got this rent-seeking by the healthcare sector largely, which is twice as large as anywhere else in the world. I mean, China had said 5% of GDP, we're spending 20%, median in Europe is like 10%, and they all have better life expectancy than we do. So this industry is not producing more health. We have the worst health of any rich country in the world. And yet the executives, the hospitals, the device manufacturers, especially the pharma companies, are making enormous sums of money. And the trouble is that that money can be used for further rent seeking. So we've got, an administration right now that's trying very hard to undo some of these things. Janet Yellen is a good friend of ours. She studied our book. She's worked with our book. C.C. Rouse was our boss at Princeton. She knows all about our book. She's she's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. They all know about this, but it looks like they can't take on the healthcare.
And the hard part about the healthcare industry is that we don't think that this is a sector where you want the free market to work. I mean, Ken Arrow, who actually proved Adam Smith's theorems about how a market can work and work well, when Ken Arrow stared at the healthcare sector, he said, the assumptions that are needed for this to be a market that works well, that is, I'm sorry, we're having a small.
No problem. Yeah, no problem.
Done. That is not going to work well. So it's not, so this is an industry that we don't want to pretend can work well as a free market. This is an industry in which there's going to have to be the government to help organize what happens within that industry. So, I mean, we think that the healthcare industry, you have to set aside differently from, for example, hairdressers, where in the state that I live in, you need a license in order to cut someone else's hair, right? So that's going to protect the people who were able to get a license, and it's going to drive up prices. And it's not just people who cut hair, it's people who do a lot of other things are protected in a way that keeps some people out. But the healthcare sector is a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, I think we understand the benefits of markets, and we're not anti-market in any capacity at all. And China seems like, a leading example of that. I mean, China really began to get rich when they deregulated markets or deregulated agricultural markets. And, it's in one famous phrase, unleashed the slumbering dynamism of the peasants. We got this enormous.
Yeah. If we can really, as you said, have a really government to play a more active role in terms of those public goods areas, so that we don't have this kind of rely on the monopoly, or maybe it's not deregulated, so that we would have a lot of challenges for getting a better service for the patient. I mean, in your book, actually, the capitalism, the future of capitalism. So there's a different form of capitalism. There's casino capitalism, rental capitalism, corning capitalism, Lincoln capitalism, democratic capitalism, state capitalism, and the list go on. And but the government, of course, plays some role. So what is the ideal form of capitalism? We know capitalism is if we really practice well. I mean, with caution, with regulation, with government involvement. Probably China is trying to do that. We have a market economy of 60 private sectors. We have another 10-15% multinationals, and then there's a 20% of SOE. So what is the best form of capitalism, and how that can be work well with the government and then serve the people well at the same time?
Well, the struggle of people to make money is a very powerful force. What some people just call greed, right? But you have to channel it in ways that are socially productive. And there's always danger there, and there'll be danger in China too, because the people are very good at that, very good at innovation is a big part of the story too. My friend Philippe Aghion has just written a book about creative destruction. That's another thing that capitalism is very good at. It comes along as new ideas, and these new ideas push aside old ideas, and old people were, previous people were making a lot of money, lose money. So there's a lot of this churn going on. But the danger is that people who got powerful from one set of innovations or from one thing will try to stop, the next round of innovation going on. And that's not something that's just to do with America or to do with China or to do with England or whatever. That's always going to happen. And it's always a danger in any system that the people who do very well at one round are going to stop the people at the next round from doing things well. I mean, there are famous Chinese stories. I mean, I won't be able to pronounce the words, but Admiral He, who had this enormous fleet of ships that were the greatest ships in the world that make the Mayflower look like an insect, and they sailed all the way to East Africa and so on. And when they came home, the emperor just put the ships away and said, you're never going to use those ships again. So there was this potential innovation in the 15th century? I mean, it's before Columbus came to America. And it was choked off because people in power were scared of it. And that is what we see in America all the time. New innovations are choked off because the previous people don't want to see them. So you've got to let capitalism really you've got to get markets to work for the people and not work for the capitalists.
Part of that is going to be, if you want this to continue, if you want this to evolve, as there is creative destruction, there are going to be people who lose, right? Those people have to, in a sense, be brought along as well. If you want this to be able to evolve peacefully, which means a safety net for the people who lost when there was this kind of innovation taking place. And I think one of the things that happened in the US was that there's real pushback against helping people who lost when there was globalization or when there was innovation, that you're on your own. Oh, well, something happened, your good job disappeared, tough luck. And I think that you can do that. You can play the game that way, but that's going to not give way to sort of a peaceful transition to a better economy. I think we have to think about social safety nets as part of running a market system well.
You've got to be able to do what David talked about before, which is you've got to have capitalism deliver low prices, not high prices. And
yeah, that's a good. So, David, what's your comment?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with a couple of specific questions that China's actually dealing with right now. When I was in graduate school, I went to graduate school in the late 70s, and the deregulation movement was in its heyday then. And people in antitrust policy were arguing that you really don't need an active antitrust policy because the market will take care of that. And people argued that we can just deregulate the financial system and they can assess their own risk and that's no problem. And China's sort of assessing where to go with both those issues now. I wonder if you could talk about those issues and whether you think they were a major cause of what's happened in the U.S. economy over the last 40 years.
I think they were right then, but wrong now, if you know what I mean. So it wasn't like that whole thing was crazy because regulations also generate a lot of rent seeking. I knew George Stigler when I was young, and George Stigler was a great proponent of that, which is the regulators get captured by the regulators, by the people they're supposed to regulate, and then they both join together to exploit the people. So there was a lot to be said for that deregulation, and it generated a lot of growth in its time. But, the situation we're in now, where I think there's widespread agreement, and again, this is one of these areas of ferment in economics, But I think everybody thinks something has to be done with the big tech companies.
Yeah.
And that, how you regulate those to retain the incredible benefits they've brought to us. And I think China's struggling with that in exactly the same way. Those companies are very, very big, they're very powerful, and they're bringing huge benefits to us, but we're scared of them. And we're scared of what they might do in the future.
Let me just note that those markets are, again, they're more competitive in China. I mean, Alibaba's Taobao market is the equivalent of Amazon, but there are lots of competitors online in that for Alibaba in that market. There's Jingdong and Pinduoduo. There are a bunch of competitors, whereas you really have Amazon sort of by itself in the U.S.
Yeah, and I think as I read I'm not an expert on China, and you know better than I do, but my sense is the Chinese government has been very active in preventing those big firms getting too large, and that's not been happening here. I actually am someone who thinks that I like Amazon so much that I think it'd be great if there were 2 or 3 of them. And I'm not sure that the world needs Twitter and Facebook at all, but that's just my personal view. And I think China has done well in those respects, and we need to do something here too.
But with the financial markets and whether or not they can assess their own risk and whether or not we can just let that roll forward without any oversight, I think we've seen what that led to in the US, which is people lean out into the wind, and if they fall over, the US has come in to shore them up because we can't let them fail. So it's kind of heads we win, tails you lose. And that doesn't seem like a really successful way forward. So I think it's kind of naive to think that this is an industry that can just manage that on their own. I don't know. I guess might disagree.
No, I agree with that. I mean, but again, what you talked about in the 70s wasn't entirely wrong. And we got benefits from it, but it went too far. And these things sort of go through cycles. But this is something that's going to change, and I think both China and the U.S. and everywhere else are wrestling.
I certainly believe the rate deregulation at the time. I want to quickly mention a conversation I had with a regional president of the Bank of America a few years ago, which just really struck with me. One thing he said was, I don't want you as a customer. The main customer I want is somebody who bounces a few checks and pays a lot of fees every month. And then I asked him, well, what about lending to small businesses? And he said, we're really not interested in that either, unless we get fees from them. So the traditional role of the banking system, which back in the 70s was lending to small businesses and homeowners, has been completely turned on its head.
And a lot of them got into hedge funds in a big way too. So, and it wasn't, a lot of the hedge funds are playing with their own money, but there were banks who got into that too. And basically we're doing it with our money. And that sort of thing, I think, was a real disaster too.
There's been, I think there has been some progress made in trying to protect people from things like your manager at the Bank of America, just trying to see if they can trip people up and get great fees to be paid, right? So there's been so it's again a case where you can't just say, let the market go and it's going to take care of itself and, everything is for the best in our Panglossian world. But we do need people in there to protect the small people along the way. Without that, we end up in a real dystopia.
Yeah, I think that what we've been discussing is really interesting because David mentioned the 70s, we've gone through the deregulations, and now probably the U.S. Small is beautiful. I mean, the government was really small government, but now we see all the government. Biden administration now is massive spending on on the pandemic fighting, 2.3 trillion on the infrastructure, and the government is also launching all kind of big program. So that's what we see other countries do the same, European countries too. So China is actually, is probably striking the right balance. We have the private sectors as a very, very active. We have multinational, we have SOE, which does all the obligation of the, lifted poverty and maybe even subsidized from that. So I mean, the world probably is learning how we can strike a right balance while the capitalism is thriving, but on the other hand, it's not get out of the hand, get out of control. So it's a new challenge for all of us. But if we don't handle that well, I mean, if there will be a deglobalization, and then we need a scapegoat for that, and China is often be the scapegoat, for example. So I think how can we really strike that balance is really interesting for the economics to study, I guess.
Yeah,
yeah,
it certainly is. These issues, I mean, one of the things that's happened in the US is that the countervailing power of democracy has much weakened because the rent seekers, to a large extent, have taken over the government. It's not entirely true, but I mean, there used to be, if you go back to 1970, there was very little lobbying by firms in Washington, and that's exploded over the last 50 years. And I don't think it's coincidental that that's the period over which the profit share has gone up and the worker share has gone down. Now you have a much more muscular government that tends to be independent or more independent of industrial interests or of banking interests or, whatever. I don't know. Big tech is counted as industrial anymore. But, and that separation is very important. And democracy is supposed to be able to do that. It's not been doing it very well in the United States recently. A lot of people have been locked out of that. And that's not just in the United States. A lot of people in Europe, with the development of populist movements and so on, who feel that they're not well represented by parliaments, which are dominated by people who have done well out of globalization, who are better educated than they are, and who have very little respect for their traditions or ways of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So China is interesting. China has been learning. China is running on the consultative democracy and has been really attaches great importance to the well-being of the community, for example, in terms of fighting pandemic, even maybe sacrifice a little bit of individual freedom on that. So people follow the lockdown and then they get a free, more vibrant economy now. But what I think China is a little bit, another interesting thing is that China has over 2,000 counties, has 260 cities, have a population above 1 million, and 31 province, city, municipality. They all compete with each other at all levels. So every mayor is like almost like it carry a lot of responsibility to the well-being of its citizens. So that system, we are seeing China is trying to create some of that, and certainly that's where I think the high economic growth comes from. But I hope that the innovation China can catch up. I mean that's where China is still is relatively late comer on that. So in terms of but in terms of the globalization, I mean China has benefited enormously on that. This is the year of China joined WTO for the 20th year anniversary, and I think that what's your take on the globalization? If China has been peacefully rising, how China and the US and EU and other countries can work together with a better economic perspective and prosperity where we can really work together on that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, we're in a really worrying situation where, there's a real danger of throwing out the baby with the bathwater sort of idea. And, you swing away from complete deregulation to something where you have this total regulation and a stifling of everything. And there's a lot of people in America who don't believe in capitalism in any form anymore. And I don't think they're powerful enough to do huge damage, but they could be. And if other bad things happen. So I think the populism in America, and you have a major political party that doesn't really believe in ballots anymore. There's a big threat there.
So I think that with globalization, the idea, when you first study economics, what you're taught is that there are these gains from trade, and so that's a good thing. And indeed, what we've seen is the pie get bigger and bigger and bigger. But as the pie gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the question becomes, how does it get distributed, right? Who wins or who benefits from globalization? And in the US, too little was paid attention to that issue, so that a few people get very wealthy from this increase in the size of the pie that globalization brought. But a lot of people, their lives were damaged, their communities were destroyed, their families saw no prospects for the future, and no one took care of that. So I think that if you need to make sure that things continue to work for the polity as a whole, and if you don't pay attention to that, if you don't tend to that garden, then bad things can happen, as we've seen happen in the US now.
So maybe the issue then will be maybe each country should really look how to adjust domestically. Let's handle our domestic issue with care, with innovation, with all the new technology and new plans. For example, I'm pleased to see President Biden said he's going to revitalize the infrastructure of US, which I think also that is one of the factors in China. The infrastructure revolution going on. Anywhere you go is a few hours a high-speed train, and that also helps the alleviating poverty in China too. So if we all really concentrate on our domestic issues rather than we blame each other, maybe that is really the way to go. We hope that we have a better communication and things like that to really have a more cooperative partnership. I was talking to Graham Allison and Joseph Nye and all those Thomas Friedman. They all said, we should cooperative. Even if it's a rivalry, let's have a cooperative rivalry or rivalry partnership rather than a geopolitical rivalry or strategic rivalry. One thing I want to say is that I have this book, it has been translated into Chinese, that Understanding Consumption, which is your 2015 Nobel laureate, one of the themes was based on that. Consumption is very important. I mean, China is want to be a consumer society. Government is stimulating consumption. There was even proposal to do circulation. Domestic consumption is now emphasized. But also, we understand that one of the things that also often China blamed is that China took away a lot of the jobs. But we know that Walmart and all the others has purchased so much goods from China and has helped keep the U.S. inflation low for the last several decades. I mean, in the 80s, U.S. inflation has gone up, but now in the last several years, only until recently, probably is getting higher. But even though there could be a little some job lost, but maybe to technology, to robotics, or to factory move to China. But also China's benefit also U.S. economy in terms of buying $1 trillion of the treasury bills, financing the T-bonds, and now with the also low high quality products. So what do you think of that? That consumption pattern that we had all the competitive advantage of each other. Should we really have a more peaceful narrative on that, rather than Trump said, "Oh, China's rip us off," and what's the real explanation for that?
I'm not quite sure I got the question, but there's this sense of what consumption is still too low in China relative to income.
No, what I'm saying, there's two questions. The consumption, of course, we are actually stimulated by your theory. We are stimulating the consumption now in China. Absolutely, we encourage more consumption. The other thing is that the U.S. consumption a lot now rely on China because China has kept the U.S. inflation low with a lot of low quality, low price, good quality products. But China often blamed for that, is that.
No, I don't think China's to blame for that, but that's, that's certainly a good thing, a help to Americans. And I had not encountered that line of thought that, China's to blame for America's high consumption patterns. But I presume that in China, there are a number of policies to help people spend more. I've always argued that, if people in China had more children, they'd have more things to spend money on. That's a very good thing to spend money on. Also, healthcare is very important there because if people save up because they're worried about big expenses for healthcare, that's another reason. The other thing that you probably don't want to hear is that there's a very strong relationship, which economists I don't think fully understand, that very high growing societies tend to have very high savings rates. And so, if China were growing less rapidly, then you would probably have more consumption. That's probably something that not a policy direction that you want to go in. But I mean, a lot of the reasons people save are for the future or to protect themselves in old age. And again, that's something where if elders, find themselves without children to look after them in their old age, they're going to have to save a lot of money to protect themselves in those times. So I think those things are all changing in China. But I noticed your recent census is showing that population growth has almost stopped or is about to stop in China. And I think it would be good if there were more children in China. I think it'd be good if there were more children here too. But I think, more children is a good, healthy sign of, people thinking the future is good.
Could I add one point to the consumption?
Yeah, David, yes, please.
One thing to realize is the difference in the growth in wage rates. After the Zhurongji reforms around 2000 in China, wages grew at 9% real per year for 15 years. Right. And for the past 5 years, I don't know about the pandemic year, but from 2015 to 2019, they were growing at 5 or 6%. Well, it's easy to boost consumption and savings when your wages are increasing so fast. These are median real wages. But we're seeing the buildup of debt in the U.S. to boost consumption, which I think is a very bad path to follow. That's just my point. I wonder if you have thought about the distinction between wage-driven consumption and debt-driven consumption.
No, I think the point I was just wanting to make is that I didn't know about those wage growths, but when wages are growing very, very fast, consumption tends not to catch up for quite a long time. So people stick with the consumption patterns they have, and they don't adapt as quickly as they might. And if you get the growth long enough, or the growth begins to come down, then the consumption rate will certainly go up. One of the effects of the pandemic has been a big reduction in consumer debt because people are using some of the payments they've got from the government to pay off their credit cards. And it's also true that many people don't have, a lot of our friends say, I wish it were over so I could spend some money. And, the things that people spend a lot of money on, like eating out or traveling or flying or tourism, those things have taken a big hit. So there's actually been a big decrease in consumption in the US during the pandemic. So if that was a problem before, it's less of a problem now.
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely the pandemic actually cut down some consumptions, for example, tourism, which counts 10% of global GDP. I mean, every year China has 150 million people outbound tourists. And that's not happening. So we hope that once the pandemic is under control, we hope the Tokyo Olympic is happening and the Beijing Winter Olympic is happening. We can revive this with the virus and vaccine, that we can revive the tourism consumption spending.
And we'll be able to have this conversation in person.
That's right. We'd love to invite you to come to CCG next time when we can start travel. But we almost come to the end, but we collected some questions from the media. Actually, they know that you're talking to us, and then they actually prepared some questions. One question is from South China Morning Post. It says that according to the data from China's latest census, an aging population appears to be a prime concern for the world's second largest economy. And there are mounting worries that competition for youth among the Chinese cities will escalate. Do you see this is any factor that could widen or narrow the wealth gap in China? That's from, yeah.
Yeah, that's hard to tell.
Without more data, without knowing the data better, that's a really hard question to answer.
Yeah.
But it's a good question.
But age structure things are very important in a whole area of economics and tend to be a little bit understudied, but yes.
Great, yeah. And certainly technology probably, that that artificial intelligence or those automation that really probably, if people not knowledgeable on those things would maybe affecting that. Another question would be from China Business Network. It says, would a wealthy tax help in combating gap between rich and poor? Are those policies introduced by the Biden administration indication in the era of a big government is back in the United States? Also, President Biden is raising the minimum wages, but also proposing a flat tax for the global operations. So what do you think of that?
Well, I think it's really time that large corporations like Amazon and FedEx actually paid any tax. And I think that's certainly one of the things that fuels populism, is this feeling that the people at the really top, especially through corporations, are not paying very much tax. And I'm certainly very much in favor of international negotiations to set a minimum corporation tax, for example, so that you don't get this enormous distortion of companies moving around and pretending to be headquartered in Ireland or in the Cayman Islands in order to avoid taxes. I mean, that's a problem you have much less than we do. And I think that's been very corrosive. It's been hard for the government to collect taxes, which it needs to do things. And it's also seen as manifestly unfair and contributes to populism, and we need less of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have another question from China Radio International. Many people talk down capitalism. French President Emmanuel Macron said during the virtual Davos Agenda 2021 summit of global leaders that modern capitalism can no longer work. So what's your opinion about that, and how we can really compare the future global governance relate to the capitalism in the future? I mean, which is your book?
Well, I think what Macron is saying is that it doesn't work in the way it's working right now, and I think those are the issues we talked about, which is rent seeking and all the rest of it. And we need a strong government that will be a countervailing force on behalf of ordinary people for the excesses of capitalism, not to abolish it. And it's very hard to know what abolishing it would mean.
Mm-hmm. So again, this is really a fascinating discussion. My staff was telling me we had about 700, 800,000 people watching this actually. So it's really amazing and very attractive. And so what I would say is that we had a very interesting discussion, and I think that U.S., China are really two largest economy. U.S. being the biggest economy, and China is the second largest. Well, a lot of things to learn from each other, and of course the books that you have, the theory that we propose, very interesting. Related to education, healthcare, and also the capitalism, what format that we can really do well. Inequality, that's really so important. China has to be aware of that too, even though China has lifted 800 million people out of extreme poverty. China has just the latest population census. Population is aging, and what to be prevented. So you have offered a lot of valuable lessons and advice for us. So to conclude, maybe you can, all of you can each say a few words to our audience still watching us, and for this discussion, what can, the two countries that we can work together and maybe have a better future together, rather than, we repeat the lessons that we don't, learn experience from each other.
I think you're exactly right. I think we need to look at the parts which are good and not throw those away. We need to work to build on the successes. But I think a lot of the problems with globalization going as far as it has is a domestic problem about how we take the benefits of globalization and distribute them locally within our own countries. And if we focused on that, I think we could make quite a lot of progress.
Yeah, I think that's the big message in the last 5 or 10 years, which is that countries need to put their own domestic house in order and not blame outsiders for what that's happening. And if they don't put their domestic house in order, if they don't look after the people who've been left behind, and that's a domestic issue, it's a policy issue, it's something that governments have to be able to do, then they run the risk of terrible things happening domestically, but also really bad things happening internationally. Because if those people, are allowed, bad things are allowed to happen and they're seen as being exploited, then they will look for scapegoats and they will blame anyone who happens to be around, whether it's China or automation or artificial intelligence or whatever. So we think that addressing, if you have a large fraction of your population whose life expectancy is falling, really bad things are happening, that's a domestic problem. We've got to fix that, because otherwise America can't really participate in the world.
Yeah, that's very, very, very stimulating, very sound advice. I agree. It's not only true for US, but also true for China, for many other countries. We've got to take care of our own people, and we have to do our own domestic politics well, because these days, domestic politics is not doing well, it affects international politics too. So we have to concentrate on domestic issues and handle our own situation well. That's absolutely very sound advice for all of us. So David, your last word.
I thought this has been a very great conversation. I wish we could go on for a few more hours. I have tons of questions to ask you, but you mentioned when we first talked that you had some ideas about how the pandemic has affected deaths from despair, and I want to just give you a chance to mention a little bit of that before we leave.
Well, we've just been looking at the pattern of deaths, which has been hard to get data on. And the stunning thing is that the people who've been suffering worse are the same people who were suffering before. And it's not obvious that would happen because the causes of death have changed. It didn't used to be risky to work in a grocery store. And now it is risky to work in a grocery store. But the sort of protection that you get from a bachelor's degree seems to be as strong against the pandemic as it was before. So one of the things, the ways I like to put it is having a BA, if you're a white non-Hispanic in America, having a BA is about as protective as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's about 75% effective. And who knew? And of course, we know sort of why it's happening, that those of us with BAs are all staying at home, we kept our jobs, nothing bad happened to us. But it's always the same people who benefit and the same people who lose. So the pandemic has not really changed that pattern.
Great.
Thank you. I think you're dealing with an issue that's one of the most important issues facing the United States and maybe the rest of the world. And I really appreciate your contribution to this.
Well, thank you. And thank you too for giving us this amazing audience.
Yeah.
It's just wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Deaton and Professor Case. It's such a fascinating discussion we have, and I really appreciate your advice at the end and those throughout the conversation, the theory and